All righty, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming back out. Before we really dive into tonight, two things. Behind you here. Yeah. Just in case you want one of those Sunday school books. Thank you, brother. So, first of all, as we get really more into the history, instead of these statements of faith, looking more really at the history of the church, I'm going to give you tonight really the extended history, which is going to take us back a long, long ways. Just to give you a general church history, this is what I teach at the seminary. For any of you that really don't know that, I teach at a seminary and teach church history 1 and 2, and then some other history courses. And this is most of what I teach, is just general church history. So I wanted to cover this so that everybody has some sort of a basis, just a groundwork of where Baptists come from, Christian history. Because a lot of us could take ourselves through American history, talk about presidents and things like that, but we don't really know much of anything about church history or Christian history. So before we dive really into that, I wanted to make some series of corrections. This is the latest rendition of things Michael got wrong. The last time we talked, I'd made a comment about Baptists being really influential in getting the First Amendment to the Constitution put on. That's true. That's right. I had said that Baptists negotiated with John Adams to get that put into the Constitution. That was what was wrong. It was not John Adams, it was James Madison. A guy named John Leland. This is a picture of both of them. So here's Madison and here's Leland. John Leland was a Baptist pastor in Virginia. And he was a very influential pastor of his time. And James Madison was running for a seat with the U.S. House of Representatives. And he thought that Leland probably had enough pull to make sure that he either did or did not get the votes. And so he went to talk with Leland, and they met under an oak grove to have this conversation. And Leland demanded, in exchange for his endorsement, that Madison see to it that a freedom of religion clause was put in the Constitution. And Madison agreed to do that, and ultimately it did happen. And Madison got the votes. So we traded votes for that. That's just the way our world works. Baptists are as political as anybody. One thing that I had up here that I thought was really funny, and I knew this, but this is one of them that I just came back across, and I thought that's such a goofy thing to happen. After that, in 1801 and 2, when Thomas Jefferson was elected president, Leland was invited to the inauguration dinner. And he arrived with a 1,235-pound block of cheese that he gifted to Thomas Jefferson and the other Constitution founders as a thank you for the First Amendment. A 1,235-pound block of cheese made by the women of his church. He had to have a wagon with 2 horses to pull the thing, and they just, in it, they had engraved the words, "Defying tyrants is obedience to God." That was in the cheese. What a weird thing. But it was something they had, if you look this up, they have how many gallons of milk and how many cows it took to produce the milk. Just a massive undertaking to provide this 1,235-pound block of cheese. I forget exactly how big it was, but it was, I think, 4 feet wide and several feet deep and tall. The thing, just a massive block of cheese. 1,200 pounds. So anyway, that's Baptist history. We thank with cheese. But getting into where we're going tonight, I just want to, we'll get through this a lot faster than you think when you see this next slide, okay? This is going to scare you at first, but with the Roman Empire, okay, in the 300s, Christianity became the official religion of Rome, all right? Constantine, the emperor of Rome, had a vision where he saw a cross in the sky, and he came under some sort of an impression that if he won this battle he was going into, it was some sort of a premonition from God, and whoever the God was a god of a cross. And so he ultimately won the battle, And come to find out, his wife and mother-in-law had been investigating Christianity quite a bit and had even embraced Christianity. And so he ultimately made a confession of faith. And when the emperor converted, that meant the empire converted. So he, in no loss of words, he forced the Roman Empire to become Christian. He made that happen. And so they just baptized everybody. The Roman Empire of that era was a pretty good place to be, even in the 300s. It wasn't in what they call the Pax Romana anymore. They had wars, but it was a very good place to be. Relatively peaceful, especially given what preceded and followed it. Not a lot of wars by any means. Most people were literate. They could read decently. Most of them spoke multiple languages. And most people felt that the economy was good enough that they could strive for success. But in the 400s, a group of people called the barbarians. Thank you, whoever said that. Yeah. The barbarians, they didn't invade per se, but they were from largely in this area, modern-day France, Germany, northern Italy. They didn't invade. What they did was they pretended to be citizens of Rome. They largely immigrated in, and then they didn't leave their culture. They brought their culture to Rome, and seeing themselves largely different from the Romans, they ultimately banded together and did invade the city of Rome. They toppled Rome, and the Roman Empire fell. Now, that was in the 400s, the Western Roman Empire. There were two Romes, one here in Constantinople and the other in the city of Rome. The Western Empire fell. And when it fell, we plunged ourselves essentially into what we now call the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages were a very different era. Even though Christianity remained the official religion of the Roman Empire, most Christians in the Dark Ages had no access to a Bible whatsoever. They never saw one. They were born, lived, and died having never seen a Bible, let alone having ever read one. And they very quickly lost the ability to read and write because education fell through when the empire fell. So what made things even worse was the church, for a variety of reasons, chose to make it illegal to translate the Bible out of the Latin language. You can give good reasons for that. One they gave was they didn't want the Bible to become polluted. They wanted to maintain the purity of the Bible, and it was easy to do that if there was only one language, because you could tell if someone had changed something. It was not what's in all the other copies. The other is they wanted to maintain familiarity with the Scriptures. They wanted people to be able to quote it. So, for instance, today, if most people in this room, if you were to quote John 3 or Psalm 23, you'd probably quote it in King James English. You would say, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Even though that's the only time ever you're going to use the word maketh, right? But that's how you've memorized it. And that was similar to the thought then. They wanted people to be familiar with the Scriptures, most easily done if you just keep it in one language. That was the thought. But what happened was all the countries stopped speaking Latin. And when you stop speaking it, it's not long before you stop being able to read it and write in it. And so very quickly, nobody could read or write or speak Latin, and therefore nobody could read or write or speak in Latin, read the Bible. They couldn't. It was a foreign document to them. So I want to give just an illustration of this that I think will be somewhat helpful. I've still got it here. This is Pope John Paul II. Some of you probably remember this guy. Want to let you hear this real quick here. It goes on that way. Okay? Now, what he is singing is called the Pater Noster. And that's very southern. Pater Noster. Like calling it the Notre Dame. But this is it in English. Or with the English translation at least. So you recognize that as you're reading it, right? The Lord's Prayer. And when you know that it's the Lord's Prayer, you hear it and you go, oh, well, that's actually very pretty. You know, you as you know what the words mean and you hear it sung, you go, oh, that's actually really nice. I like that. But it's because you know what's being said, right? It's meaningless if you only heard it in Latin, because none of us speak that language. And so it's beautiful to hear, but you just sit there and you go, very nice, you know. And you even heard Pope John Paul, as he introduced it, he said, let's sing the Pater Noster, and then he says, in Latina. And all the people laugh, because he had to say that, because in his era, they were moving away from speaking Latin. But it was a joke for the Pope to say to a group of Catholics, let's speak Latin, because they had done that for almost 2,000 years. But now that's something that they're moving away from. It's a very new thing for the Catholic Church to not speak Latin. Okay, that was so dominant for so very long. In church, the service was entirely in Latin. The sermon was preached in Latin. The homilies were read in Latin. The hymns were sung in Latin. The psalms were read in Latin. Prayers were in Latin. Everything was in Latin. And so if you are in Germany in the Middle Ages and you go to church, you can't read the scriptures, and you can't understand the prayers, and you can't listen to the sermon. It's completely foreign. You have no idea what's going on. And there were generations of people who were, to the best of their ability, Christian, but who really did not understand a single thing about what Christianity was, because they'd never read the Bible, they'd never heard a sermon. They had no clue what Christianity meant. The only thing they knew was they were baptized as babies and they needed to submit to whatever the Catholic Church said. That's all they knew. And they didn't have any way of correcting that. Now, in the medieval ages, the Catholic Church became a little bit more cynical. They began to realize there was a lot of money to be made. And so their motivations changed. And they continued to refuse to allow anybody to read the scriptures in their own language, not because they were afraid that it would be corrupted or polluted, but because they felt most people were not responsible enough to handle it. You give a Bible to just the average man, he won't be responsible with it. And so they kept it in Latin, and then they made sure the only way you could learn Latin was by becoming a priest or a monk in the Catholic Church. You were not allowed to learn Latin unless you were a priest or a monk. They guarded that pretty closely. Well, that brings us to the 1300s. So there's 1,000 years of history done right there, okay? That was pretty quick, right? In the 1300s, a guy comes up named John Wycliffe. He was English, but he was a Catholic priest. He could read and write in Latin, and he could read and write in English. Or we wouldn't call it English because it's Old English, but this is his English, okay? You probably thought that was Latin or Greek, but that's English in the 1300s. It's closer to German than modern day English. But Wycliffe began advocating for Bible translation into what they called the vulgar languages, the languages of the people. He wanted to translate the Bible into English. And so he attempted to do so. He never saw it come to fruition in his lifetime, but very shortly after he died, his collection of translations and translations done by people who were aligned with him came together and they published what's called the Wycliffe Bible. and it was the first English translation. It was published around 1384. So hear me say that, 1384. And most of us only know of the King James Bible. We think that the King James was the first English translation, but the King James was published in 1611. So this is over 200 years earlier. They already had the Bible in English. The Catholics didn't like that, as you can imagine. They did not want people reading the Bible in English. And so they declared Wycliffe a heretic, even though he was already dead. They collected all of his works that they could find, including the Bibles. They burned those. And then they had his body dug up, and they burned what was left of his body, just, I guess, as a symbol. And they labeled everyone who followed him as a lollard. As an Old English word, what we would call a babbler. A babbler. These were people who wanted to confuse everybody, just like the Tower of Babel. They wanted to change the language and confuse everyone. And so if you wanted to translate the Bible out of Latin, you were called a lollard. You were a babbler. You were trying to confuse everyone by changing the language. That was generally the way it worked until about the 1400s. Then another guy came up named Jan Hus, spelled like Jan Hus, but it's Jan Hus. He was Czesian, which means he was from Eastern Europe. He read the works of Wycliffe. He agreed with his conclusions, and he started translating the Bible into German and other vulgar languages. He was also a priest, so he could read Latin. The Catholic Church got wind of him when he was yet alive, and they invited him down for a trial where they were going to decide whether he was Christian or not, based on the fact that he was translating the Bible out of Latin, and accordingly he was reading it and finding some of the things done by Catholics to be unbiblical. They condemned him as a heretic. Now, they had promised him before he came that if he would be willing to come, he would get safe passage there and back. But as soon as they condemned him as a heretic, they condemned him to die, and then they set him on fire. He has a famous quote. This is in the early 1400s. His quote is, let me make sure I've got this exactly right. The quote was, I'll give you this hint. His last name, Hus, that's the Czech word for goose. Yeah, I know, right? It's a goofy name. But I mean, we have people name things like Baker, and we don't think about it, you know. So anyway, Jan Hus, John Goose was his name, literally in Czesian. But he said, right before they burned him, he said, "You may roast a goose right now, but after 100 years there will sing a swan, and he you will not be able to silence." You may roast a goose right now, but in 100 years there will sing a swan, and he you will not be able to silence. Now, in 100 years after him, there came a man named Martin Luther. Martin Luther did not want to not be Catholic. He loved being Catholic. He loved everything about being Catholic. The problem was he became a monk, and he learned how to read and write in Latin. And at one point when he was in college learning how to be a monk, he stumbled upon a Bible in the library. He had never seen one before. It was chained to the bookshelf so no one would remove it. But he had no idea such a book even existed. He thought that there were only remnants, parts and pieces of Bibles remaining, that there was no such thing as a Bible. So this was a revolutionary thing for him to find. And he started reading it, and he quickly came upon several things that he felt were not biblical that were being done by the Catholic Church. And so he began to write them down, and pretty soon he had a list of 95 things that he'd found that the Catholic Church was doing that he did not find to be biblical. And so on October 31st, 1517, he took his list of 95 complaints, he called them the 95 Theses, and he posted them to a bulletin board. It was at the college. Now, that's not how the story is normally told. It's often misunderstood. The bulletin board was the front door of the church at Wittenberg, which was on the college campus. But what priests and monks and scholars at the college would do is if they wanted to debate something or they wanted to discuss it, they would write something in Latin, so only priests, monks, and scholars could read it, and then they would post it to the bulletin board, which was the front door of the church, and priests, monks, and scholars would come along, be able to read it, and they would get together to discuss it. That's what Martin Luther was trying to do. He wanted to have a discussion amongst the priests, monks, and scholars about 95 things he had found that he did not believe were biblical and were being done by the Catholic Church. Somebody, and to this day nobody knows who, somebody came along, copied it down, translated it into German, and published it. So now everybody has read these. And within 2 months, it had been translated into every language in Europe and transferred to every country in Europe. So every person in the European continent had access to this within 2 months. He did not mean for that to happen, okay? Some people have referred to Martin Luther as a blind man. They said he's like a blind man who was trying to find his way home one night, and he got lost. And he ended up stumbling into a church, and in finding his way through the church, he walks all the way up the church tower. He comes to the top. He's just about to stumble out a window, and he reaches out to grab anything, and he grabs the rope connected to the church bell and wakes up the entire city. That's what he did. This was a complete accident. He did not mean to start what he started, but he did. Those 95 Theses fomented, and people began to declare themselves as disobedient to the Catholic Church openly. They called themselves Lutherans. And so the Catholic Church quickly called for Luther to come for a trial, same way they had Jan Hus, promising him safety there and back, same way they had Jan Hus. He knew how this was probably going to go, but he went anyway. And they asked him, "Are you a Hussite? Are you like Jan Hus? Do you think that we should be following what the Bible says instead of what the Pope says? Do you disavow church history and tradition?" And he initially said no. He said, I'm not a Hussite. They said, "Well, we'll come back tomorrow and talk about it." And that night, he read some of the writings of Jan Hus, and he came back the next day and he said, "Well, you know what? Come to find out, I actually am a Hussite. I agree with what he said." So they condemned him, and they would have killed him, but something happened. Unbeknownst to Martin Luther, several of his friends, who were very powerful men, kidnapped him. He didn't know that was going to happen any more than anybody else. They took him to a castle in the mountains and hid him for about 2 years. And he grew out his hair and grew a big beard and disguised himself, even went by a fake name. But he survived that. And later on, he became the leader of what's called the Protestant Reformation, because the people following him were protesting the Catholic Church. And so they took that word protest, and we became the Protestants. Completely accidentally. Martin Luther, again, he did not want to split the Catholic Church. He wanted to reform it, but they would have no part of it. Any questions on any of that so far? Luther shouldn't be looked at as some figure that we should all aspire to be like either. He had great theology in a lot of places, but there are also a lot of places where he was really messed up, both religiously and socially. Late in his life, so one of the things he believed that towards the end times there would be a revival among the Jews. Many people believe that. Many people today believe that. I kind of believe that. So just to say, there's something there. He believed that what was happening in his day with this Reformation was an end times event. It was a revival to happen right before Jesus came back. And so he expected the Jews to repent and turn to Jesus. And when he started preaching to them this new biblical teaching that they hadn't heard in 1,000 years, and the Jews still rejected him, he didn't take that well. And so he starts writing very broadly and very influentially, mind you, that Jews should just be killed, all of them. Just slaughter them. And don't just kill them, burn their bodies when you're done, and then scatter their ashes to the wind so that nothing remains of them. And he was very, very anti-Semitic toward the end of his life. So if you ever want to read him, like I said, a lot of stuff's great, but a lot of it's not. There's a lot of stuff really, really not so good. Okay? Now again, that is all happening on mainland Europe here. So Martin Luther is a German. Jan Hus was Czechoslovakian, that's in this area. Wycliffe is English. So that's all happening in this area, but it hasn't really spread out yet. What really helped it spread was a guy who, again, didn't mean for this to happen. A guy named Henry VIII. He was the King of England. Henry VIII, some of you probably remember studying him in history class growing up. He has 6 wives. If you remember him, that's what he's famous for. You may remember, we were taught to remember how his wives died. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. His wives had a rough run of it. And the reason was, his first wife was having a hard time giving him a male heir. And she had 2 daughters, but every time they'd have a son, the son would either die in the womb or die in infancy. And so he wanted to have a son to take his throne. Well, he decided it was his wife's fault. Something was clearly wrong with her. She couldn't have a son. So he needed a new wife. Problem was, his marriage was completely legitimate. There was no way out of it. He couldn't get a divorce because kings weren't allowed to be divorced. So he wanted to have his marriage annulled, which is slightly different from a divorce. But the Pope would not annul his marriage. Well, when he heard about this whole Protestant idea, wait, I can be a Christian and still go to heaven and not submit to the Pope? Ah, well, I like that. And so he decides, well, I'll do that. And so he declares independence from the Pope and creates what's called the Anglican Church, the Church of the Angles, the Church of Angleland, England. And who do you think he set up as the head of the church? Him! He's the new Pope. And he gets to decide whatever he wants. And first order of business is my marriage is annulled. Okay? And so King Henry VIII declares himself the head of the Church of England. He takes all the churches and monasteries from the Catholics, deports all the priests and monks that will not submit to him, and creates the Church of England. And to this day, the King of England is the head of the Church of England. He's the head of the Anglican Church. The late Queen Elizabeth was the queen, the head of the church. Yeah. And even we have Anglican churches in America, and Episcopalian churches or an offshoot from that. They are still religiously submitted to the head of England. They are under the king or the queen of England because that is the head of the church. Crazy stuff. The Anglican Church, I know this is going to be a shock, quickly became just as corrupt as the Roman Catholic Church had, because when you get church in bed with politics, the church gets pregnant. And it comes out a very political baby, okay? And so when you don't have a separation between church and state, that's what's going to happen. There had never been such a separation, and so the Anglican Church became very corrupt very quickly. And so there was a group of people who wanted to purify that church. They became known as the Puritans. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church. Again, they didn't want to branch off from it. They wanted to purify it, to reform it, to make it better, more biblical. They weren't having much luck with that. So they said, well, I'll tell you what, let's go to these colonies we have. We'll still be submitted to the king. He'll still be the head of the church, but we'll have a little bit more religious liberty because we're in the colonies. And so they came over on ships called things like the Mayflower. And they formed places like Virginia, and they called it New England because it was supposed to be England, just new. And so it was New England. They came over seeking religious freedom for themselves, mind you. We'll find out here in a moment. They were very particular about who got religious freedom, but they did want freedom in a way that really wasn't allowed in England. Some people, however, stuck around in England. They were Puritans, but they didn't believe that the king should still be the head of the church. They believed that there should be a separation between the church and the state. And so they were called separatists. The separatists believed that the church should not be under the influence and the authority of the king or any government. So they start reading the Bible very thoroughly, trying to figure out how the church should run. One of the first things that they come upon is they believed, in many cases, that each church should be an authority over itself. You shouldn't have some great big presbytery that should tell every church what they're supposed to believe and practice. And so they began to split again, and many of them became Congregationalists. Congregationalists, they believed in a congregational church government. Every church should have local autonomy. You should be autonomous, self-governing, not submitted to any other larger presbytery. In doing that, going through everything the church was practicing and believing, they came to the issue of the ordinances, the Lord's Supper and baptism. And suddenly, when they started trying to figure out how to do infant baptism biblically, they ran into a problem, which is there's no examples of it. There's nothing in the Bible telling us how to do infant baptism. In fact, there's no examples of it at all. There's no example ever in the Bible of an infant being baptized. There's definitely nothing to regulate it. So they started asking the question, should we be baptizing infants? That had been done for 1,500 years. Should we still be doing that? And that led to a movement that resulted in what we now call Baptists. Okay, we came out of the Congregationalists. So it was Roman Catholic, Anglican, Separatist, Congregationalist, Baptist. It just kept evolving. As we got more and more reliant on the Bible, I would say, more and more scriptural, we ended up being Baptist. This started with a guy named John Smith. John Smith came to this conclusion that there really was no argument to be made for infant baptism. That wasn't a position you were allowed to have, okay? In England, that wasn't allowed. So he had to run from England. He went to Holland, which is mainland Europe, and he started looking for any Christian writings that he could find that supported what he called and what we call credo baptism. That is, baptism upon your profession of faith rather than baptism of infants, which is called paedobaptism, child baptism. He started reading books by credo Baptists, and he quickly came upon the writings of a group of people called Anabaptists. This fun bunch, they have a separate but parallel history with Baptists. A lot of people get them confused. They think that these are our ancestors. Separate history. These Anabaptists come out of Switzerland. They were originally under the teaching of a guy named Ulrich Zwingli, who was one of the three main reformers. It was John Calvin, Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli. And Zwingli, by the way, had executed a couple of them because they denied infant baptism, and he banished the rest of them. They're not the ancestors of Baptists as we know them today, but they are the ancestors of modern-day Mennonites and Amish. The Amish and the Mennonites come from Anabaptists, although they're very different from them in ways that I'll point out in a moment. Anabaptists, for example, most of them denied the Trinity. They didn't believe in the Trinity. They believed in a monadic God. They were what today we'd call oneness believers. They only believed in one person as God. They also believed that the sign gifts were still operative. That means they believed that you could prophesy and predict the future. People could speak in tongues. They were ecstatic in their worship. Some of them would roll around on the ground and bark like dogs, and some of them would just start screaming at random and say they were filled with the Spirit. So they were very different from what you'd find in Mennonites and Amish today, to say the least. They believed Christians should share everything in common, that there was no such thing as private possessions. You didn't own a home. You didn't own any wealth at all. You didn't own land. Nothing was yours. It was the community's. Christians were supposed to share everything. And that way, there were early forerunners of communists, because that's exactly what communists believe. You have no private property. There are no personal possessions. The Anabaptists believed in that. And ultimately, all of this came together in Germany in a rebellion called the Münster Rebellion. The Münster Rebellion is a very interesting event. There was a guy, this story sounds made up. This sounds like something out of a book, but this is absolutely true. There was a guy named John Mathis who believed that the city of Münster, Germany, was the New Jerusalem, and that Jesus would return to Münster, Germany. So he collected a group of people who were engaged in something called the Peasants' War at the time. They were waging a war against upper-class people. Remember, they're communists, so they don't really believe in wealth. He collected them, took over the city of Münster, and declared it the New Jerusalem. They ordained a king who said he was a descendant of David, and they said that they were going to reign for 1,000 years, and at the end of that 1,000 years, Jesus would come back. Okay, that was what they said was going on. Immediately, they began practicing polygamy. They began wedding child brides. Any woman who refused to marry any man who proposed to her was immediately executed. That you could not say no to a man who proposed to you. And at one point, John Mathis, who started this whole thing, one of his 16 wives, a woman named Elizabeth Wandsharer, went public with the fact that he was hoarding jewelry and living lavishly while other people were starving, which, being communist, wasn't allowed. So Mr. Mathis responded by taking her to the town square, and in the midst of all the people, he made them to start singing a song while he beheaded her, and then danced around her corpse and made them dance around her corpse, singing hymns to God. This is the craziness that was going on in the Munster Rebellion. Absolute insanity. The Catholics identified these people by the fact that if you wanted to join their movement, you had to be baptized again. You had to be rebaptized. And so they called them rebaptizers, or in Latin, Anabaptists. Just to tell you how this whole story wraps up so you'll know, Mathis had a dream that he and 12 other men in his army marched out into the battlefield naked, and God killed all of their enemies in their presence just before Jesus returned. So he did that. He got 12 of his fiercest warriors, and they all marched out into the battlefield naked, and were immediately killed, unsurprisingly, of course. And less than a year later, the city under siege fell to the Catholics again, and they tortured all the remaining leaders, and 3 of them they put in these cages and hanged them at the Church of St. Lambert's in Munster. And they left them in those cages for 50 years. They starved to death very quickly, but they just left their bodies up there as a reminder for 50 years. After 50 years, they pulled the bodies out, but these cages still hang there. This is a modern photo of St. Lambert's Church in Munster. The cages are there, just as a constant reminder. So, it didn't go well. Now, when John Smith starts talking about credo baptism, and I think we should be baptized upon our profession of faith, people start hearing this stuff, okay? He says, maybe we shouldn't be baptizing babies, and they're thinking Munster. They're remembering this. And so they don't take that very well at all. So when John Smith goes back to England and he starts preaching the Baptist tradition, the London Christians, all through England and London specifically, are very worried. They're very worried. They begin to say the Anabaptists have come to England. And they're going to start practicing polygamy, and they're going to start killing people, and they're going to overthrow the monarchy, and they're going to declare a new kingdom. They thought Baptists were absolute anarchists, essentially, and communists. So the Baptists very quickly have to write down what they believe and what their plans are. And so in 1611, the Baptists in England write what's called the Helwys Declaration of Faith. A guy named Thomas Helwys was an early Baptist, a friend of John Smith. They wrote down what they believed. Now, they were the exact opposite of what we would call a Calvinist. In the Helwys Declaration, they denied predestination. They denied limited atonement. This is an exact quote. They believed that men may fall away from the grace of God and from the truth which they have received and acknowledged. They believe you could lose your salvation. And so that's what the first Baptists believed. But very, very quickly after, there came a group of Baptists who rejected that. They rejected that predestination was not true. They rejected that limited atonement was not true. They rejected that you could lose your salvation. And they became known as particular Baptists. The first group became known as General Baptists. We still have General Baptists today. You'll hardly find a particular Baptist church. The particular Baptists wrote down what they believed in 1644, and I love what they named it. a confession of faith of 7 congregations or churches of Christ in London, which are commonly but unjustly called Anabaptists. They said, we're not Anabaptists. That's not what we are. Stop calling us that. Okay, so they wanted to be called Baptists, not Anabaptists, because they knew that's not what we are. We're not that. So they wrote that in 1644. That was called the First London Baptist Confession of Faith. Years later, in 1689, the king signed what's called the Act of Toleration, which made it legal to be a Baptist. And so they published in 1689 the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith of 1689, which is what I hand out from time to time. You'll find it in the foyer. As time went on, Baptists really grew, and their beliefs became known in America. There was a guy named Roger Williams. I'd love for this to be the most popular photo of me after I die, wouldn't you? Climbing a mountain, in the snow. That'd be pretty neat. But that's Roger Williams. He became convinced of Baptist ideas. He was a Puritan in America at the time, and he wanted to start a Baptist church in America. Well, the Puritans, although they came here for religious freedom, quickly found they wanted religious freedom for them, not for other people. And so they did not want Baptists in America, so they threw him out, and they cast him to an island, an uninhabited island that we now call Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, he founded a city called Providence and established the First Baptist Church in America. That was in 1638. First Baptist Church in America. It still stands, by the way. You can go visit that. I wouldn't recommend what they believe. It's like many Baptist churches gone crazy over the years, but it's still there. Fun fact, Rhode Island is the most Catholic state in the Union, and we founded it. Isn't that wild? Founded by Baptists, the most Catholic state in the Union. Anyway, we need another crusade. So he founds the First Baptist Church in America, but it wasn't easy, and nobody liked it. Even Roger Williams ultimately left the Baptist congregation. He didn't finish his life as a Baptist. It was very, very difficult to be a Baptist. To give an example, 6th of March, 1680, the state of Massachusetts ordered for the doors of the First Baptist Church of Boston to be nailed shut. And anyone found worshiping as a Baptist was to be banished from the colony or executed if they refused to leave or convert to Presbyterianism. That was it. We'll deport you or kill you. You're not allowed to be a Baptist. Not in Massachusetts. The most frequent execution for Baptists was drowning. They take you out and drown you. Kind of an ironic, you want to be baptized again, we'll baptize you. And so they'd take you out and drown you. The only places where you could be a Baptist in early America was Rhode Island, being founded by Baptists, and 2 other colonies, West New Jersey and Pennsylvania. That's because Pennsylvania and West New Jersey were owned and operated by a guy named William Penn, who was a Quaker. And Quakers had come out of the English Civil War in the mid-1600s. They were rather religiously tolerant. They were very, very okay with people having different beliefs. In fact, they even ordained female missionaries and ministers of the era, very rare back then. They sent out 2 missionaries to Boston, Mary Fisher and Ann Austin. They preached in Boston, and then 4 years later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony began hanging Quakers for preaching. So they understood religious persecution, and so in those 3 colonies, Rhode Island, West New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, those were the havens for religious pluralism between Baptists and Quakers. That was actually the only colony where you were allowed to be a Quaker, was in Rhode Island, outside of the colonies that they owned and operated. So Baptists and Quakers became allies over their joint persecution. And so that's actually where we're going to stop for the night, because that brings us to the early 1700s. And once you hit the 1700s, the straight line to Antioch becomes really clear. You have people that are connected to Antioch in the 1700s, guys like John Gannot and John Sutton. We'll talk about them next week. You start having schools built and established that train the pastors that will come to Antioch, like the Hopewell Academy, which was in Providence, Rhode Island. So the direct line to Antioch is going to be a lot more clear next week. But I wanted to give this background so that you all have a general understanding of Christian church history and where Baptists come from. I will say, just as a sort of appendix to this, there's one other major theory about where Baptists come from, and it's called secessionism. It's a view that was widely popularized. You gave me a book a couple years ago, Glenn, called The Trail of Blood by a guy named J.M. Carroll. J.M. Carroll is the brother of B.H. Carroll, a famous Southern Baptist. The Trail of Blood follows the other theory, which is that Baptists do come from Anabaptists, and they have a history that goes all the way back to Jesus. That theory I don't hold to, but there are godly men that do. Recently went to a historical meeting where the main leader of the meeting believed that. So there are godly people that believe that. That's not the position that I hold, because I see it pretty clearly in what I just presented to you. I think that the history there is pretty obvious, and the difference between us and Anabaptist is quite clear. Yeah, to Credo Baptist ever. There is a long history. Right. Yeah, and that is something that is valuably presented in the Trail of Blood. He does talk about how that the Catholic Church persecuted Credo Baptists all through church history. And that's definitely true. There's always been, I think it's fair to argue, there have always been groups of people who believed Credo baptism. They rejected the baptism of infants. That's almost inarguably true. But to say that that's our heritage, I think is something that both isn't true, and we don't even want to say that. Because the Anabaptists, I would say they weren't even really Christians. They didn't believe in the Trinity. They denied all sorts of stuff that's foundational to the Christian faith. But yeah, there is valuable information in the Trail of Blood and other books like it. That's a very brief pamphlet, J.M. Carroll's Trail of Blood. Very, very small. There are much denser books that follow that theory, and it's interesting history to say the least. But yeah, I just wanted to make that known. There is another historical theory. And up until probably the 1970s, that was the dominant teaching, that Baptists came largely from Anabaptists and other groups like them. That's why J.M. Carroll and B.H. Carroll and others believed that. It wasn't really until the 70s, 80s, 90s that what I'm advocating here really became the mainstream belief of where Baptists came from. So you could say that I'm just as much a product of my time as J.M. Carroll was, and validate or invalidate either one on that basis. But there's other views. Other thoughts on any of the stuff that we've covered tonight? I know that was really a jet tour through 1,700 years of church history, but
I was wondering, kind of a question. During the Dark Ages, 5th century, 15th century, when Roman Catholicism was at its height, climax of its power, that was a false gospel. In other words, groups such as the non-Catholic,
yeah.
So when Jesus promises that his church will be built upon the rock of truth, the gates of hell would not prevail against it. So in that time period, those people, they were just basically dead, baptism was given. How were people saved when they were underneath that power of Catholicism? That's all they heard.
Mm-hmm.
How do we look at that?
Yeah, well, the Catholic Church, I would say really, the Catholic Church in a lot of ways could be seen as orthodoxly Catholic or Christian, really up until you get to the dividing line of the Reformation. They start to fork off when you get past the late medieval. Like I mentioned, they became very cynical and money grabbing. But as far as the doctrine that they taught, obviously there was baptismal regeneration. They taught that you were saved by baptism, and that happened when you were a baby, and there were errors there. But if you were able to understand what was being taught, there was a lot of opportunities for people to believe in what we would call true Christianity. The biggest obstacle to me is that nobody could they couldn't get the gospel. it wasn't communicable. It was in a foreign language, and they weren't able to read the Bible for themselves. I mean, it was a total mess. But in the 1500s, specifically with the Council of Trent, when you get to the Council of Trent, I think it's 1521, that's where they completely, I would say, apostatize. The Roman Catholic Church at the Council of Trent completely forked off from Christianity. Because they were facing, you got to bear in mind the date, 1517, Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg. 1521, you have the Council of Trent. They're responding to the Reformation. And one of the anathemas that they pronounced, anathema means you have said that somebody is not Christian. They are cast out of the church. One of the anathemas that they pronounced was anybody who teaches that you're saved by faith alone is anathema. So they literally made it illegal to preach salvation by faith in the Catholic Church in 1521. Before then, that was not a rule. And in fact, even today, if you talk to most Catholic priests, they don't believe what most Catholic doctrine teaches. If you read the Catholic Catechism, a lot of the priests don't even believe what Catholics teach. Like, they don't believe. So this is something many of you may not know. Catholics believe in a doctrine called transubstantiation, which means they believe that when you take the Lord's Supper, not metaphorically, literally, you are eating the body of Jesus Christ. And when you drink the wine, you are literally, not metaphorically, drinking the blood of Jesus Christ. They believe that when it's blessed by the priest, it literally becomes his flesh and blood, and you consume it. And if you talk to most Catholic priests today, they don't believe that. But that's what the Catholic Church affirms. That's its doctrine. So I think that there was probably a lot of that through those Middle Ages, priests that were probably teaching a true gospel to whoever they could tell it to, even within the Catholic Church that largely would have disagreed with them. Because you always have offshoots coming out of the Catholic Church, people that taught all sorts of things that the Catholics didn't affirm. And they would never, a lot of the time, unless you actively said the Pope is wrong and the Church is wrong, they wouldn't condemn you as a heretic. So I think there is a place through that 1,000-year period, 500 to 1500, to say that a lot of those people who were Catholic were truly Christian. Misled in many ways, but truly Christian. But after the Council of Trent, I don't see how anybody could affirm what the Catholic Church teaches and truly be Christian. If you don't believe in salvation by faith, you don't believe in salvation of the Bible, which means you don't believe in true salvation.
Same way, that Abraham was credited with righteousness, even though he knew practically nothing about God. Other than God's like,
Right.
Hey, here I am, I'm your God. It's like, all right, we're going to go with this, and
Right.
I believe your promise, and he credited to it as righteousness.
Yeah.
The same way that God uses the consciousness of the people, that are suppressed.
Yeah. And that's a good point, is that, Abraham never had a Bible. Moses wrote the first 5 books, but by the time you get to David, there was only those 5. And so people with very limited access to the scriptures have been godly people who truly knew God throughout history. We just think in the Christian age, we're so reliant on the Bible, it seems very difficult to think that we would be anything like that. But I think when God, this is the point of it. When God said that his church would be built on the rock and the gates of hell wouldn't prevail against it, I believe him. And I'm sure you do. So that's why I'm kind of forced to say that. Because for 1,000 years, everybody who claimed the name of Christ was Catholic. And so I can't say all those people were not Christian, because Christ promised to build his church and maintain it. And so I have to hold that they were truly saved, almost against the will of the church leading them.
The book was mentioned, the Trail of Blood.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm not mistaken, that book, what it is doing is trying to take a group of people that's always preached the truth apart from the Catholic Church down through the years.
Mm-hmm.
I've read the book, I think it's been years ago.
Yeah.
But they would actually they go back to John the Baptist and would say today, the Baptist Church is the church, visibly,
Yeah.
which would be called the Baptist Bride doctrine, which I would disagree with that. But I think that's kind of how that book went, trying to trace people that's always believed in sound doctrine, apart from the Catholic Church down through the church age.
Yeah. And you get into landmarkism. That's a big part of that. Baptists are the only true church because we trace ourselves all the way back to Jesus. Everybody else is,
But all people
yeah,
we get it wrong.
Yeah, we've all gotten it wrong. And I mean, if you're going to say Baptists have been here all the way through, and then you look at what some of those people believed, like I said, I mean, the Anabaptists specifically, I would rather say a Catholic was a Christian than an Anabaptist, because at least Catholics believed in the same God as us. Anabaptists didn't even believe in the same God. So, yeah, there's a mess. That gets into all sorts of things that are interesting to talk about. Yeah. All right. Well, there's so much that we haven't covered. If you're ever interested in talking, like I said, I love talking about church history because this is what I teach. I've got a meeting with a student tomorrow who just wrote a really good paper on the Apostles' Creed. So I love talking about this stuff. Love to converse about it, and anytime you want to. But if there's nothing else, I want to ask if anybody has any prayer requests that they want me to be in prayer for.